What does it mean when the man who claims to hold the keys to heaven himself chooses to dwell in hell? Imagine a world where the very figure who kneels before the altar, who blesses the multitudes with trembling hands, also drags his own blood into the most forbidden embrace. We are taught to believe that the papacy stands as the ultimate symbol of morality, a citadel of purity against the darkness of desire. But what if that citadel was rotten from within? What if the man closest to God on earth raised his own daughter not for virtue, but for vice? This is not a question born of blasphemy. It is born of history of documents and whispers of rumors carried by terrified courtiers and foreign ambassadors who could scarcely believe what they saw. It is the story of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, and his daughter Lucrezia, a golden-haired figure remembered not for her holiness, but for the scandal that clung to her name like incense that cannot be washed away. You and I live in a time where even the faintest suggestion of corruption at the highest levels sends shockwaves across the world. But in the 15th century, Rome was not shocked by sin, it was drenched in it. And yet, even in that ocean of decadence, the Borgias were whispered about as if they had crossed boundaries so foul, so unspeakable, that to name them aloud was to risk choking on the words themselves. Incest. Father and daughter. Brother and sister. The dark theatre of pleasure unfolding beneath the frescoes of the Vatican. Consider then what it must have meant for a young Lucrezia to grow up in the gilded cages of the papal apartments, her every movement watched not as a daughter, but as a vessel of beauty to be controlled. How many times did she feel her father's eyes upon her, not as a child, but as a possession? How often did her brother's hand linger too long on her wrist, his gaze too heavy with unspoken hunger? History gives us no clear answers, only fragments, only reports from horrified observers, only the silence of Lucrezia herself. And yet, that silence is louder than words. We begin this journey not with condemnation, but with revelation. For we are not here to judge, but to uncover. We peel back the veil, not because we seek scandal for its own sake, but because in the ashes of this family lies a truth about human nature, power and desire. When morality bends before ambition, when flesh becomes a tool of politics, what lines remain that cannot be crossed? Ask yourself as we step into the Vatican of 1492 if even the Pope himself could defile the sanctity of family. What hope was there for the rest of humanity? Step back with me into a world bathed in candlelight and blood. The year is 1492. Renaissance Italy glitters like a jewel, its city-states swollen with wealth, its artists painting visions of paradise across vaulted ceilings. Florence exalts Michelangelo, Venice drowns in commerce and silk, and Rome, the eternal city, becomes something else entirely, a theatre where salvation is sold for gold, and power is the only scripture that matters. In this Rome, the Vatican is not a sanctuary, but a palace, a place where the marble corridors echo not with prayers, but with the laughter of courtesans and the clinking of goblets filled to overflowing. Cardinals draped in scarlet host feasts, more fitting for emperors than servants of Christ. They gamble beneath the crucifix, their fingers greasy with roasted meats, their tongues loosening with wine. Their sermons warn against lust, even as their own chambers reek of perfumed bodies. And at the centre of this empire of contradiction sits Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI. His rise to the papacy was not ordained by heaven, but bought by coin and promises whispered in smoke-filled conclaves. He is not a shepherd of souls. He is a monarch cloaked in holiness, a man whose enemies mutter that he has exchanged the cross for the sceptre. His court dazzles with processions, with banquets, with endless spectacles meant to silence dissent and hypnotize the faithful. Yet beneath the jeweled facade lies something far darker, an appetite without limit for power, for territory, and for flesh. Here, power is absolute, and with absolute power, morality crumbles. Who is there to hold the Pope accountable? To accuse him is to risk damnation, to oppose him is to invite death. And so, the Vatican becomes a sanctuary not for purity, but for indulgence. Alexander surrounds himself with mistresses and illegitimate children, parading them openly through Rome, as though the commandments themselves had been rewritten for his family. Among those children is Lucrezia, his daughter, whose golden hair and pale skin soon become the talk of the city. Courtiers whisper of her beauty. Ambassadors write home of her allure. Poets liken her to angels. Yet all the while, one question festers in the minds of Rome's onlookers. Why does the Pope guard her so jealously? Why does he insist she remain near him, cloistered within the papal apartments, as though she were a treasure too precious to be shared? We must understand this stage before we can comprehend the acts performed upon it. The grandeur of the Renaissance was not the grandeur of virtue. It was a mask, a painted veil concealing the rot beneath. The Vatican was a theatre where Alexander played both Pope and King, and his family, his mistresses, his sons and his daughter, became unwilling actors in a drama of power and desire. It is here in this suffocating splendor that the first shadows of perversion would begin to grow. In the labyrinth of marble corridors and candlelit halls, a whisper can spread faster than fire. Rome was a city of ears servants, lurking in corners, ambassadors spying for their masters' priests, listening with sharpened suspicion. And in the late years of the 15th century, those whispers began to circle around one name, Lucrezia Borgia. She was born in 1480, a daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, long before he claimed the papal throne. From the beginning, she was marked not as her own person, but as a piece upon the chessboard of dynastic ambition. She was raised in convent schools, groomed in languages and music, taught to move with grace and to charm with silence. But when her father became Alexander VI, her role shifted. She was no longer simply a daughter. She became an ornament of power, a symbol of beauty paraded to prove the strength of the Borgia name. At first, the signs were small, easy to ignore. The Pope kept her closer than was proper for a girl approaching womanhood, while other noble daughters were sent away to convents or into political marriages. Lucrezia remained in the papal apartments, her presence a constant at his side. Ambassadors noted his fondness, the way his hand lingered upon her arm during feasts, the way his gaze followed her, as though she were not his daughter, but his possession. Then came the rumors, half-muttered, denied, yet impossible to kill. It was said that Lucrezia was not only her father's jewel, but his mistress, that Cesare Borgia, her brother, shared in that forbidden bond, that the Vatican itself had become a brothel not of strangers, but of blood. Some dismissed these tales as political slander spread by the Pope's enemies to tarnish his reign, but others swore that the whispers carried a kernel of truth. For why else would Alexander guard his daughter so jealously, refusing suitors, delaying marriages, keeping her in Rome, even as the alliances of Italy demanded otherwise? And then there was Lucrezia herself. Descriptions from envoys paint her as radiant, but also strangely detached. Smiling, yes, but the smile of a mask, polished, careful, without warmth. She charmed all who saw her, but none could claim to know her. Was she complicit in the games of her father and brother? Or was she a silent victim forced into roles that horrified her? The chronicles are silent. Her own voice, drowned by centuries, remains absent. And it is in that silence that dread grows, for silence often hides the unspeakable. This is how corruption begins, not with open acts, but with shadows. A father's hand too close, a brother's gaze too long, a daughter's life too tightly controlled. And in Rome, where sin was commonplace, even whispers of incest had the power to freeze the blood. It was in this climate of rumour and restraint of appearances hiding obsession that the Borgias approached the line that should never have been crossed. The boundary between rumour and reality is often a fragile one. In Rome, where gossip served as both weapon and entertainment, even the most grotesque stories could vanish in the haze of slander. But with the Borgias, whispers seemed to take on flesh. There were nights when doors to the papal chambers opened too late, when lights burned too long, when the laughter of feasts turned to sounds better left unnamed. Accounts survive from ambassadors' diplomats who wrote home with trembling hands. They speak of banquets where Pope Alexander VI presided not as the vicar of Christ, but as a master of ceremonies for decadence. These were not mere dinners, but spectacles. Tables groaned beneath roasted peacocks, golden chalices overflowed with wine. Musicians played until their fingers blistered. And among the guests were not only princes and courtiers, but courtesans, dozens, sometimes hundreds, brought in to sate the appetites of the papal household. The most infamous of these spectacles came to be known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, a night where feasting gave way to orgy. Chroniclers claimed that naked dancers performed among the guests, that candles flickered against walls splattered with spilled wine and sweat, that the Pope himself watched as his children took part in scenes no chronicler dared describe in detail. Whether every element of these stories is true, we cannot know. But the fact that such accounts were written and widely believed tells us much about the darkness that clung to the Borgia name. And then there was Lucrezia. She was present at these feasts, her beauty paraded before ambassadors, her presence far from innocent. Some wrote that she sat at her father's side like a queen distributing prizes to the lovers who pleased him most. Others whispered that she herself was among the prizes. The line between daughter and consort blurred until it was no longer visible. Her brother Cesare, notorious for his cruelty and ambition, was often mentioned in the same breath as though the siblings shared not only blood, but beds. These tales horrified Europe, yet they also fascinated. Kings and dukes could dismiss the stories as lies, but they repeated them in private, savouring their grotesque detail. Rome was intoxicated with scandal, and the Vatican itself seemed to breathe corruption. For Lucrezia, the line had been crossed. Whether by force, persuasion, or silence, she had become entangled in her father's hunger, her brother's desire, her family's grotesque theatre. There was no returning to innocence. From that moment on, every gesture she made, every marriage arranged for her, every birth she endured, was overshadowed by the rumour that she belonged not to herself, not even to her husband, but to the Pope who raised her. This was no longer the uneasy whisper of suspicion. This was the collapse of all boundaries between father and daughter, between faith and depravity, between God and the flesh. Once the line has been crossed, the corruption no longer shocks, it festers. For Lucrezia Borgia, life became an endless performance upon a stage she had never chosen. Each day was gilded, perfumed, ornamented with jewels and silks. Yet beneath that glitter lay a monotony of control, a suffocating cycle of desire and manipulation. To the world, she was a bride to be traded a token of alliance. Marriages were arranged and broken with merciless speed, her body used as the mortar for political walls. Her first union to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro was celebrated with fanfare, but quickly dissolved once her father found the match less useful. Giovanni fled, terrified not only of political betrayal, but of whispered threats that Lucrezia carried another man's child. He claimed bitterly that the Pope had demanded his annulment, because she was already experienced the cruelest euphemism for incest that Rome's tongues could conjure. Within the papal apartments, her role was more complex, more grotesque. She was daughter, yes, but also confidant, perhaps lover, certainly pawn. Cesare, her brother, burned with ambition. his hand never far from the dagger, and his gaze never far from Lucrezia. Was she to him a sister or a possession? The chroniclers leave us no certainty. Yet the stories of secret pregnancies of infants, born and vanished of letters in which she signed herself with chilling intimacy, these fragments paint a portrait, not of innocence, but of a young woman entangled in the darkest web of family desire. Daily life for Lucrezia was lived under eyes that saw her not as human, but as symbol. The court adored her beauty, her golden hair, her skin pale as ivory, her manner so graceful it seemed divine. And yet, behind the mask lay a woman whose choices were stripped from her. She smiled because to frown was to invite suspicion. She obeyed because to resist was to risk ruin. Her very silence was the language of survival. There is tragedy in this paradox. She was celebrated as a Renaissance angel, yet used as a vessel for the most unholy appetites. Surrounded by riches, she was never free. Adored by poets, she was never known. She could hear the laughter of feasts echoing down Vatican corridors, smell the sweat of men who worshipped her father's excess, feel the weight of Cesare's presence always near her. Each sensation must have reminded her of the cage in which she lived. What did she think in the quiet moments? Alone in her chambers, listening to the rustle of silk curtains, did she pray for release? Did she weep? Or had tears long since abandoned her? We will never know, for history preserves only her silence. And silence in her case is more terrifying than words. Thus, the daily existence of Lucrezia Borgia was not the life of a woman, but the performance of a role, a daughter, a wife, a mistress, a pawn forever consumed by the hunger of those who should have protected her. No empire of pleasure endures without cost. For the Borgias' indulgence that once intoxicated Rome began to sour, leaving behind the bitter taste of suspicion and scorn. A family that had feasted on power and flesh soon found the world's eyes fixed upon them with disgust. And Lucrezia, at the center of her father's obsessions, bore the heaviest weight of all. Her first marriage dissolved under the pretext of her husband's impotence, left behind more than humiliation. Giovanni Sforza, her cast-off husband, retaliated with words that echoed through the courts of Italy. He claimed she had been taken by her father, shared by her brother. In an age where slander was a political weapon, such accusations might have been dismissed as spite. Yet with the Borgias, the rumors found fertile ground, because everyone already believed them capable of the unthinkable. From then on, Lucrezia carried a stain that no jewels could conceal. Every alliance proposed for her hand came shadowed by doubt. Was she a virgin bride, or already corrupted beyond redemption? Suitors hesitated, whispers spread, and her father's desperate attempts to marry her advantageously became more frantic. Each new union, Giovanni Sforza Alfonso of Aragon, Alfonso d'Este, was both a shield against rumor and a confirmation of it, for each collapse left the world more certain that Lucrezia was cursed by scandal. And still strange events unfolded around her. Servants vanished. A maid said to know too much drowned in the Tiber. Lovers of convenience were found dead, strangled, stabbed, or quietly poisoned. The Borgias were rumored to own a ring, its gemstone hollow filled with venom, to be released in the lightest touch. Whether true or not, Rome whispered that Lucrezia herself wielded it, her beauty hiding a lethal secret. Even childbirth, that most human of experiences, became tainted with dread. Stories told of a hidden chamber in the Vatican where she bore a child of unknown paternity. Her father's, her brother's, no one dared to decide. The infant was whispered about then, quietly vanished from history, like a candle extinguished in the wind. True or false, such tales eroded what little dignity remained to her. And the people of Rome, once dazzled by the family's splendor, began to mutter openly. Priests used their sermons to veil accusations. Nobles laughed at the Borgias behind closed doors, Foreign courts treated their ambassadors' reports not with outrage, but with weary certainty. The Pope's pleasure had come at the cost of his own family's legitimacy. The throne of St. Peter was surrounded by poison, not the poison of herbs or rings, but of reputation irreversible and suffocating. For Lucrezia, the price was isolation. To be adored outwardly but distrusted inwardly. To be sought as a wife yet feared as a lover. To live in a palace overflowing with riches, yet to feel the world beyond its walls recoiling from her. Her beauty no longer inspired awe, it inspired suspicion, and that suspicion was a slow, unrelenting punishment. The seeds of indulgence had flowered into consequences, and as history teaches us, the harvest of such seeds is never merciful. Every dynasty that climbs too high eventually feels the ground tremble beneath it. For the Borgias, the tremor began not in a single moment, but in a slow unraveling. Pleasure had been their sustenance ambition, their lifeblood, but decadence corrodes even the sharpest blade. By the dawn of the 16th century, Alexander VI was no longer the vigorous pope who had defied God and man alike. His body, once bloated with indulgence, began to betray him. Age deepened the lines in his face, weakened his grip on power, and left him vulnerable to the vultures circling Rome. Cesare, meanwhile, the brilliant yet monstrous sun, had turned darker still. Once his father's enforcer, he had carved a path of blood across Italy, seizing cities with ruthless efficiency, strangling rivals with his own hands, leaving a trail of bodies as monuments to his ambition. But even he was not immune to the rot spreading through his family. His enemies multiplied, his allies thinned, and paranoia became his constant companion. Whispers claimed that even Cesare's eyes grew suspicious of Lucrezia, the sister he had once guarded so jealously. Perhaps he feared her beauty as a rival source of power. Perhaps he knew too well what her silence concealed. And then there was Lucrezia herself, no longer a child, no longer merely a pawn. She had been married again this time, to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, a union meant to rescue the Borgia name by binding it to one of Italy's most prestigious houses. To the outside world, she had been elevated, finally granted dignity, respect, and the semblance of independence. But inside, she remained a woman scarred by years of manipulation, rumors and unspoken horrors. Accounts from Ferrara describe her as graceful, cultured, a patron of poets and musicians. Yet, beneath the surface, lay exhaustion. She had endured annulments, betrayals, accusations, perhaps even incestuous bonds she could never name aloud. She lived surrounded by luxury, but her letters, those rare fragments of her own voice, speak of melancholy, of illness, of longing for peace she never found. Meanwhile, her father's hold on the papacy was faltering. Enemies within the church sharpened their knives, waiting for the inevitable. Foreign powers, disgusted by his excesses, began to undermine him. And in Rome itself, the people grew weary of scandal. The same tongues that once whispered in fascination now spat in contempt. The Borgias, who once ruled with fire and gold, stood upon a crumbling stage, their masks slipping, their sins too heavy to conceal. Lucrezia, caught between her family's ruin and her own battered dignity, became the most tragic figure of them all. No longer the innocent child, no longer the puppet of her father, she was a woman crushed by the very power that had raised her. In her the world saw both victim and accomplice, angel and whore, pawn and queen. And as Alexander's health decayed and Cesare's empire of fear collapsed, the weight of the family's sins pressed hardest upon her. The Borgia theatre, once filled with laughter, music and flesh, was now darkened by silence and dread. Death rarely arrives with poetry yet. In the life of Lucrezia Borgia, it came with cruel symbolism, as though fate itself demanded one final act in the theatre of her family's ruin. She had survived decades of scandal, whispers of incest, the collapse of her father's papacy, and the violent ambitions of her brother. She had endured marriages arranged and destroyed pregnancies surrounded by suspicion, the suffocating gaze of Rome. And yet it was not poison, not dagger, not political revenge that claimed her life. It was childbirth, the most ordinary, the most human of trials that delivered her to the grave. It was 1519 in the city of Ferrara. Lucrezia, now nearly 40, had lived in her husband Alfonso d'Este's court for almost 2 decades. By then, she had fashioned a new mask, a duchess devoted to art patron of poets, beloved by many for her refinement and generosity. For a time, it seemed as though she had finally escaped the shadow of her family's infamy. But shadows do not vanish, they linger waiting. Pregnant with her 8th child, her body weary from years of strain, she entered her final labour. The chambers filled with the scents of incense and candle wax, the muffled prayers of attendants, the muffled cries of agony that no jewel-encrusted ceiling could soften. Accounts say she delivered a daughter, but her strength bled out with the child. Fever seized her, and within days she was slipping away, her once luminous face, pale and hollow, her golden hair damp against her temples. Those who surrounded her at the end saw not a temptress or a conspirator, but a woman broken by the weight of her life. They say she clutched a crucifix as her breath grew shallow, whispering prayers, not for power, not for pleasure, but for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what she had done, or for what had been done to her. We cannot know. Her silence remained her most faithful companion until her final hour. There is irony here, bitter and inescapable. A woman whose name had been synonymous with poison lust and scandal, whose body had been treated as a pawn in the games of father and brother, did not die in the flames of political murder, but in the quiet agony of childbirth. Her womb, which had been used as a weapon of alliance, and perhaps as an instrument of incestuous desire, became the very cause of her death. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of a pope, rumoured lover of her father and brother, passed into the earth at 39. The grandeur of Rome, the silks of Ferrara, the whispers of courtiers, all vanished in that moment. She was no longer legend, no longer pawn, no longer scandal. She was simply a body, pale, and still laid to rest in a convent far from the stages where she had once been paraded. Thus ended her life, not with spectacle, but with tragedy so ordinary it becomes unbearable. When death comes, it often silences scandal. The voices that once mocked, accused, and whispered fall quiet, for the object of their fascination can no longer defend herself, no longer feed their hunger. So, it was with Lucrezia Borgia. Her death in Ferrara in 1519 brought no grand lament from Rome, no thunder of mourning bells from the Vatican. She was buried quietly in a convent, her body lowered into the earth, as though the world was eager to cover what had always been considered unclean. In Ferrara, her passing stirred sorrow. She had, in her later years, won the admiration of poets, scholars, and courtiers. They wrote of her grace, her charity, her refinement as a duchess who patronized the arts. But outside those walls, the silence was telling. Rome did not mourn. Europe did not pause. The woman who had been branded by rumor as the Pope's mistress, who had embodied the corruption of her family, slipped into the grave with scarcely a ripple. And yet, that silence was not peace. It was unsettling, heavy, like the hush that follows a violent storm. For though her body was gone, her name remained, and with it, the stain of all that had been whispered about her. No one knew where the truth ended and the lies began, and perhaps no one wanted to know. The ambiguity was more powerful than certainty. It allowed each retelling to grow darker, more grotesque, until Lucrezia's shadow became larger than her life had ever been. The papacy of her father, Alexander VI, was remembered not for doctrine or faith, but for corruption. The reign of her brother Cesare ended in blood and exile. But it was Lucrezia, more than either of them, whose name lingered on the tongues of Europe. She was not remembered as a duchess or patroness of the arts. She was remembered as the woman who had shared her father's bed, who had borne her brother's children, who had been both virgin and whore, angel and demon. The silence after her death allowed those myths to harden into legend. In Rome, where once her presence had inspired both awe and revulsion, her absence left an emptiness almost more disturbing. The Vatican continued its rituals, its incense, its processions. Another pope wore the tiara, another family claimed influence. But the memory of the Borgias lingered like a foul scent, an invisible reminder that the sacred halls had once housed sins so deep it could never be exorcised. Silence can sometimes be a mercy, but in Lucrezia's case, it was a curse. For silence left space for legend, and legend is merciless. Her death brought no absolution, only a vacuum into which scandal poured like smoke, suffocating her memory. The world moved on, but it did not forget. It never truly forgets. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia Borgia was lowered into her grave, yet her name continues to echo heavy with the weight of scandal. Few figures in history have been so completely consumed by rumour, so permanently stained by whispers that may or may not have been true. She was a duchess, a mother, a patron of the arts, a woman of undeniable influence. But none of these roles survived the centuries. Instead, she became legend, an embodiment of decadence, of corruption, of incest whispered in candlelit corridors. The name Borgia itself transformed into a curse, a shorthand for poison, lust and betrayal. Plays, novels and paintings across Europe turned Lucrezia into a figure at once alluring and grotesque. Sometimes she was depicted as a seductress wielding a poisoned ring, sometimes as a victim trapped in her father's shadow, sometimes as both at once angelic in appearance, demonic in action. Each retelling blurred the line further between fact and invention. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy, not truth but myth, an eternal uncertainty that feeds the human fascination with taboo. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, was remembered as the most corrupt pontiff in history, a man whose reign embodied the collapse of morality at the highest altar of Christendom. Her brother Cesare was remembered as a warrior consumed by ambition, a tyrant undone by his own ruthlessness. But Lucrezia, she became something different. She became the question itself. Was she the orchestrator of scandal or its victim? Was she guilty of incest or condemned by lies too monstrous to deny? Did she wield poison with a smile, or did she weep behind closed doors while her family used her as a pawn? We will never know. The records are fragmentary, contradictory, blurred by the agendas of enemies and admirers alike. But perhaps certainty is not the point. Perhaps what endures is the unsettling reminder of what happens when power becomes absolute, when morality bends to ambition, when desire is unchecked by conscience. Lucrezia's life, whether as guilty seductress or tragic victim, illustrates one truth, that in the shadows of power, humanity's darkest instincts are never far away. And so, her name lingers, not as history, but as warning. In her silence, we hear echoes of every figure consumed by corruption. In her legend, we see the reflection of our own fears, that those who claim to lead us, those who cloak themselves in holiness, may be the very ones who defile the sacred most completely. As you step back from this story, ask yourself, what is more terrifying? The thought that Lucrezia Borgia was guilty of the sins whispered about her, or the thought that she was innocent, destroyed forever by the desires of others? The silence of history refuses to answer. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all.